Welcome to the Maier Museum of Art. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. I want to let you know that today's lecture is actually the second of 4 lectures that we are hosting on Sundays for our winter and spring calendars. On April 7th, Dr. Leslie Shipley will discuss the theme of borders in 2 contemporary landscape photographs that are included in the exhibition in Gallery 4, Developed and Disturbed, Visions of the American Landscape. On April 14th, in collaboration with the Dante Society, Dr. Lamar Cecil will discuss the 27th Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini. And you can learn more about those programs and others on our website. But today's lecture is entitled, There Will Be No Peace in This Land, John Brown, Jacob Lawrence, and the Morality of Terror. When our speakers suggested this title and asked if it was too long, my immediate thought was, yes, it's too long. We won't be able to put that on a postcard. And I thought about the polls that suggest that the average viewer spends 15 seconds on a website, and I thought, I'm not so sure if that's going to work. But then I considered our speakers and the fact that they are widely regarded in their fields and admired by many on this campus, so I thought it was worth the risk, and I think that indeed it paid off. John D'Entremont is the Theodore H. Jack Professor of History at Randolph College. He earned his degrees from the University of Virginia and Johns Hopkins University. His main research is on the history of Virginia, the ever-changing history of Virginia. Kathleen Placidi is a grants officer at Sweetbriar College and an art historian with a focus on American art. She has taught courses in art history in many colleges in Virginia and is currently an adjunct professor here at Randolph. Her degrees are from Case Western Reserve University with additional coursework at the University of Virginia. And I don't want to spend any more time introducing them. I want to get right to our dynamic duo, who are partners in crime tonight or this afternoon and also in life. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and I believe John is going to start.
Hello. Well, thank you for coming indoors on this nice day, and special thanks to the seniors who are here, giving up the end of your senior dinner dance weekend to listen to this downer of a talk on terrorism and violence. It's not exactly perhaps the appropriate way to end this memorable, social, fun weekend, the biggest social weekend for those of you who don't know on the campus. But then, as they say, if college doesn't bring you down, it's not doing its job. So we're doing our job. Well, let's look at John Brown in 1856, 3 years before his raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, there's a weather-beaten looking guy. There's a grizzled looking guy. Maybe you could say a determined looking guy. Not the life of the party, not a fun guy, but a man who has a sense of destiny and mission. And he did have a sense of destiny and mission by the time this photograph was taken in Kansas in 1856, because for the first time in his life, John Brown had become a celebrity. He had become nationally known because of his exploits in a mini-civil war that was going on in the territory of Kansas. Kansas was part of the Louisiana Purchase, and in 1820, in the Missouri Compromise, parts of the Louisiana Purchase were put off limits to slavery, forever, presumably. But in 1854, a new law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, had repealed the Missouri Compromise and had opened all of the land of the Louisiana Purchase to the possibility of slavery if people who lived there voted it in. This was a terrible setback to anti-slavery people in America. It rewrote the contract that had, they presumably, been sacredly sealed back in 1820, and now was giving slavery a potential new lease on life in all of the Western territories, or virtually all of them. Well, what happened was predictable. Instead of having orderly elections to decide whether the people wanted slavery or not, Southern slave owners, especially from the nearby slave state of Missouri, rushed into Kansas with no intention of living there permanently, but only with the intention of voting and influencing others to vote for slavery whenever the election was held. And in response, idealistic people from the North, free soilers, poured into Kansas with no intention of living there, but only intending to influence the election. Brown would become the most famous of these northern free soilers. For the first time in his life, he had a very clear purpose, and he was doing something in which he could be a profound success. At the age of 56, he hadn't succeeded in much of anything, at least financially or in his businesses. He tried a tannery, he tried a wool business, he tried farming. Nothing really had worked. About the only thing that he was successful in was replenishing the human species, because he had fathered 20 children by 2 women, 7 by his first wife, 13 by his second. But beyond that, he was depressed and considering himself perhaps a failure until he found Kansas, and Kansas found him. In May of 1856, after the free soil capital of Lawrence, Kansas was burned to the ground by a pro-slavery posse, John Brown took it upon himself to retaliate. He took a band of men, including a few of his own sons, and went along Pottawatomie Creek in the dead of night, pulling pro-slavery men and boys out of their cabins and hacking them to death with broadswords. These men were not involved in the sacking and burning of Lawrence. Some of the people he killed were not even slave owners, but they were on the pro-slavery side, and that was enough for Brown. What Brown was saying was that we will go to any lengths in a righteous cause. I am not afraid to kill people in the most brutal fashion if they're on the wrong side of this bedrock issue involving slavery or freedom. And that kind of chilling ruthlessness brought him nationwide attention, with some people praising him for doing things that they themselves could not ever do. But at this time in the 1850s, the abolitionist movement had been around for 30-odd years, and it hadn't really accomplished very much, at least in the minds of the abolitionists who thought slavery could crumble if you only persuaded slave owners to give it up, persuaded slave owners that slavery was immoral. Moral suasion is what they called it, and moral suasion, since the early 1830s and even earlier, had persuaded maybe a dozen slave owners to give up their slaves and become true abolitionists. Pacifism, moral suasion had simply not worked at ending slavery. And so many peace-loving abolitionists, while they could never do what Brown did, they couldn't help but admire Brown's decisiveness, his willing to do anything to bring slavery to an end, to spread terror among slave owners so great that they would be afraid to hold slaves any longer, even if it meant, in the process, it meant starting some sort of civil war. Well, Brown was thus a celebrity, talked about in newspapers north and south and even across the Atlantic for his exploits in Kansas. And now he wanted to top himself. He wanted to do something bigger and greater, more immense in its consequences. And in 1857 and 1858, he began to hatch in his mind a plan, as he put it, to take the fight to Africa itself, by which he meant to take the fight to the slave South, where the slaves actually were, and foment a slave rebellion. He made a list by the end of 1857 of places he might invade in the Upper South, which had arsenals, which had stores of weapons, and places that had both arsenals and armories, which manufactured weapons. Those places he would choose among to decide which place he would take a small band of people and invade, take weapons, distribute them to slaves, start a slave rebellion, which he hoped would bring about a civil war, no matter how bloody, that would bring slavery to an end. Somewhere along the line, as he was preparing this in 1858, he grew a beard. Now, facial hair was becoming more and more in by the end of the 1850s, though it didn't fully flower until the 1860s. So Brown was not alone, but he grew a beard that was self-consciously in the style he thought of the Old Testament prophets. He looks a bit like Jehovah himself here, but he in his mind fancied himself a new Gideon. Gideon was the Old Testament prophet from the book of Judges who smote the Midianites and became known as an example of somebody who could lead a small band of men against a massive enemy force and win in the name of a righteous cause. Gideon was perfect for John Brown as a model. Well, Brown set about raising money for this exploit that most people didn't really know the details of, and he kept changing the details in his own mind. He started laying the groundwork, especially in 1858. In February of 1858, he started traveling in the East. He went to Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass, the most famous African-American of the 19th century, a man who at the age of 20 had escaped slavery in Maryland, and by now had written 2 autobiographies and published a newspaper, an anti-slavery paper in Rochester. He spent a month at Frederick Douglass's home, laying out his plans to invade Harper's Ferry, capture the armory there, which manufactured thousands of weapons for the U.S. Army, capture an arsenal which stored those weapons, as well as weapons made in Harper's Ferry by a private company, distribute them to slaves, and start a slave army which would move down the Appalachians, raising recruits and starting a race war which would morph into a national civil war. Douglass thought this was pretty wild. Douglass had shifted from being a pacifist abolitionist to a believer in violence when necessary. But Douglass thought this was a loony idea. He thought it loony because it could never work. Douglass knew something about the topography of Harper's Ferry, and he knew that Harper's Ferry would be a death trap, that it would be impossible to hold for any length of time. He knew the militia would gather very quickly, that Brown was doomed. He was crazy, he felt. He didn't think Brown was crazy, but he thought this was crazy. Brown stayed at his house for a month, though, trying to persuade him. And Douglass, though full of admiration of Brown's chutzpah, tried to persuade Brown not to do it. This would cause more harm than good, that failure in something like this would be the worst possible thing. It's apparently at this point that he introduced Brown to a newly arrived fugitive from South Carolina named Shields Green, a young man in his early 20s who had just escaped slavery, and Douglass was helping out in Rochester. Shields Green also was worked on by Brown. "If I do this, will you join me?" Douglass strongly urged Green not to do it. It would take another meeting later on with Green, but finally Green spoke to Frederick Douglass the last time they spoke and said, "I guess I will go with the old man." Well, in March of 1858, he moved from Douglass's home in Rochester to a town near Syracuse to speak to Gerrit Smith, who's in the middle of the bottom row. Gerrit Smith was the moneybags of the abolitionist movement. For decades, he had been funding abolitionist activities, pacifist abolitionist activities. Like the rest of these guys, he was getting sick of peaceful means. Moral suasion had been a failure, he felt. And he was willing to listen to a celebrity like Brown, who he knew might actually carry out a violent scheme and not just talk about it, and that this might work. So Gerrit Smith cautiously said, "Well, if you go ahead with this, if you can raise a little army, I'll give you money." And ultimately, Gerrit Smith was responsible for giving him over $1,000 to raise recruits and weapons for this raid. He went on from Peterborough, New York, to Boston, where he spoke to the others in this list. All 6 of these together became known as the Secret Six, because they all knew more than anybody else except Frederick Douglass about what Brown was planning. And all of them had in common that they were pacifist abolitionists getting tired of pacifism. They were just so frustrated that this evil institution was perpetuating itself and growing in power, and nothing worked except maybe violence would. George Stearns was another wealthy merchant who was profoundly philanthropic and gave another $1,000 to the cause. Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister, a direct descendant of John Parker, who had led the Minutemen on Lexington Green. And one of Theodore Parker's prized possessions was Parker's musket, which he kept above his office, and he said he would use against any slave catcher who came to Boston in search of a fugitive slave. Samuel Gridley Howe founded an institution to help the blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, the Perkins Institute for the Blind, it's known as now. And he was sort of the Helen Keller of his day, because he worked closely with, he was sort of the Annie Sullivan of his day, because he worked closely with the Helen Keller of the mid and late 19th century, a young woman named Laura Bridgman, a blind woman who became a celebrity at the Institute for the Blind. He was also married to Julia Ward Howe, who would write the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was a Unitarian minister who, more than any of them, had moved to violence the soonest. In 1854, when a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns was arrested in Boston and was about to be sent back to slavery in Virginia, Thomas Wentworth Higginson led a raid on the jail in Boston to try to free Burns, who was under heavy guard. The raid killed one of the guards, who was just a guy trying to make some money, but they failed to rescue Burns. That episode should have raised in the minds of sensitive people the problematic nature of violence, but Higginson wanted to build on it by doing something that would succeed. And then Frank Sanborn was a young schoolteacher in Concord, Massachusetts, a follower and friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson, an erudite young man who read books. I had read, among many other things, biographies of Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution of the early 19th century, which had overthrown slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, renamed Haiti, had thrown the French out, and created the first black republic in the modern world. These were the Secret Six. Now, in 1859, Brown decided that it was the year that this plot would be fully consummated. He rented a house in Maryland, a farmhouse, 7 miles from Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry itself is at the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers. It's where the Shenandoah River flows into the Potomac on the Potomac's path to the sea. The Potomac is on the right here. Harper's Ferry is in the middle with a B&O Railroad bridge connecting it with the Maryland shore, and the river on the left is the Shenandoah. If we could move to the next slide, we'll see more closely in this modern artist's rendition the factory buildings. You can see some of them are belching smoke. That's the armory. All of those buildings along the Potomac River. Tens of thousands of muskets and rifles for the U.S. Army have been manufactured there. And you can see the B&O Railroad. I think there's a train approaching from the left-hand side. Those are the railroad tracks leading into the bridge going over to Maryland. This is Shenandoah Street here, paralleling Shenandoah River, and just off the map on the Shenandoah River, in a little islet that's just off the map, was Hall's Rifle Works, where an entrepreneur with the last name of Hall manufactured state-of-the-art Sharps carbines for the Army and for private sale. And there was an arsenal in Harper's Ferry that stored those weapons. And this was the place that Brown intended to raid. Now, the army that he raised, he hoped to raise maybe 100 men. He only managed to raise 21. In part because he really didn't want to talk to that many people who might squeal, as often happened with slave rebellions, and so he wanted to keep it fairly small. In part, though, because some of the people he did talk to chickened out or decided that this was a fool's errand. He waited as long as he could in the summer of 1859 in this farmhouse, keeping his 21 men hiding in the attic so the neighbors wouldn't notice that there were a bunch of men there doing nothing and wondering what they were doing there in this newly rented farmhouse. His 15-year-old daughter Annie kept the house along with a somewhat older daughter-in-law, Brown told people he was there to buy cattle for a cattle business. But it was clear, the neighbors kept coming around asking questions, it was clear he had to move soon or the whole thing might fall apart. So a date was set for the night of October 16, 1859, when he and his 21 men marched the 7 miles on foot from the farmhouse to Harper's Ferry. A couple of them, including his son Owen, were detached from the unit when they got to the bridge to cut telegraph wires along the Maryland shore. So they never went into Harper's Ferry, but 19 men did. With Brown, they crossed the bridge, they fanned out through the armory. Brown himself, with 3 other men, 2 black, 1 white, went all the way down to Hall's Rifle Works, secured that. He kept the 3 men at the rifle works, and he ran back to the armory to join the rest of his men. The militia, of course, were aroused very shortly, within half an hour or so, in various parts of the Maryland and Virginia countryside, and started getting on their horses and riding for Harper's Ferry. He really didn't have much time, and to make matters worse, a train arrived, moving from west to east on the B&O. It was stopped by his men, but foolishly they let the train, after a couple of hours, they let the train continue on, which really wiped out any advantage gained from cutting the telegraph wires, because once it got further east to the next station, it stopped where the wires were still working going east, and they wired to Washington that something bad was happening at Harper's Ferry. And at that point, Colonel Robert E. Lee was put in charge of a contingent of about 90 troops, which he put on a train and headed west toward Harper's Ferry. So Brown had gotten himself into the death trap that Frederick Douglass predicted. And that night, later that night, by the middle of the night, it was clear that slaves were not coming to help him. No slave voluntarily joined John Brown in the entire raid that lasted about 33 hours. The militia was coming. He was rapidly being surrounded. There were troops on the way from all over, and some of the militia had blocked the path on the Maryland side of this bridge, so there was no escape there. So what Brown did is he took most of his men and some hostages and holed up in the fire engine house. That's the engine house. You don't want the armory to burn down if you're the federal government, so this is where firefighting equipment was kept. And here John Brown made his last stand. You can visit the engine house now. It's been moved a few yards, but you can visit the same building. The building's been around. It appeared at a World's Fair in the early 20th century and was at a black college for a while. Now it's part of the National Historic Park. Now, having told you all of this, and as you can imagine, holed up in a firehouse surrounded by militia and federal troops, Brown could only hold out so long. After one night, one full day, and another night at dawn on October 18th, the Army had arrived with some Marines. Jeb Stewart, a lieutenant working under Robert E. Lee, went to the door of the firehouse, knocked on the door. Brown peeked out. Brown said he wanted to negotiate. Stewart said, no, you have to surrender. Brown said, no, I'm not going to surrender. And Stewart waved his hat, and the troops charged, burst through the door with a battering ram, bayoneted 2 of Brown's men to death, and stabbed Brown, but only wounded him, and took the rest of them prisoner. Now, who were these guys? Let's look at the raiders, spend a few seconds on each one of them. Because it's called John Brown's raid, but there were many raiders. Watson Brown, one of his sons, went out with the flag of truce at his father's orders during the long day that they were holed up in the firehouse, and was immediately shot and mortally wounded by one of the militiamen. Oliver Brown, another son, was also shot and terribly wounded while standing in the doorway of the firehouse. He groaned and moaned all through that afternoon and into the night. His father got sick of his moaning and said, "Be quiet and die like a man." finally, he stopped moaning in the middle of the night, in that long night of the siege. Brown finally said, "I guess he is dead." Next, we have Owen Brown, another son, but Owen Brown lived. He escaped because he did not go into Harper's Ferry. He was assigned to cut the wires on the Maryland shore. And once it became clear that it wasn't working, he was able to escape. He had also been assigned, after the wires were cut, to go to a schoolhouse where a bunch of weapons had been stored for slaves that they expected to flock to the colors and join them. Once no slaves showed up, and a couple of other Brown raiders who had escaped from the ferry came to Owen Brown and told him, "It's a fiasco, we need to flee." He took off and managed to escape. Jeremiah Anderson had fought with Brown in Kansas, had been twice arrested in Kansas, arrested by pro-slavery forces and escaped. He was one of the ones killed at the very end of the raid, his body pinned to the wall of the firehouse by several bayonets. John Copeland was a young black man, a student at Oberlin College, the only biracial college in America at that point. It goes without saying, an idealist, but they were all idealists, obviously. He escaped from the rifle works in a boat that he stole, but he was captured weeks later, taken back to Harper's Ferry, tried, and hanged. Osborne Anderson, a fugitive slave who had escaped all the way to Canada. Brown recruited him in Canada. He went into Harper's Ferry with Brown. He also stole a boat and escaped, and managed to make good his escape, one of the few who got away. John Cook was assigned the task of living in Harper's Ferry as a spy for a year. He lived there. He was a ladies' man. One observer said he had his way with the ladies' mothers as well as maidens. And one of them, a young woman, he managed to impregnate and was required to marry her in April of 1859. And she bore him a daughter before the raid happened. When the raid took place, he left Harper's Ferry that night, the night of the raid, and joined his comrades at the farmhouse, marched with them to the ferry, was one of the ones assigned to cut the telegraph wires, so he never went back into the town, which he had lived in for over a year as a spy. He escaped for a while, but weeks later, Virginia authorities tracked him down, took him back to Virginia, and hanged him. I don't know if his wife from Harper's Ferry was present at his hanging, but nobody knows what her attitude toward him was when she found out the truth about him. Barclay Coppock was a Quaker from a family in Iowa. He and his brother joined Brown. He escaped, his brother did not. Shields Green was the new friend of Frederick Douglass, who Douglass warned not to go with Brown, but Shields Green said, "I will go with the old man." He had a chance to escape in a stolen boat with another raider, but he said, "No, I need to help the old man." He went to the engine house, where he was captured and was hanged at the age of 23. Edwin Coppock, a Quaker from Iowa, who went there with his Quaker brother. He's the man who killed the mayor of Harper's Ferry. 3 Harper's Ferry white people were killed in this battle. 9 others were wounded. Coppock didn't know he was shooting the mayor. The mayor was an elderly man who just happened to be peeking around the side of a building when Coppock shot him. But the death of the mayor led the Harper's Ferry locals into even more of a rage than they were already in. And they began trying to lynch their prisoners and succeeded with one. Albert Hazlitt had fought with Brown in Kansas. He was described as a good-looking, fine fellow, overflowing with good nature and social feeling. He too escaped, was captured, and brought back and hanged. John Henry Cagey was self-taught, very erudite, very intellectual. He was made second in command by Brown. He was 24 years old. He held the rifle works for a few hours until it was overrun by militia. He tried to escape by wading and swimming the Shenandoah River and was shot dead in the river. The river's pretty clear at that point. He lay there for a couple of days and was the subject of target practice by people from the shore. Lewis Leary, a family man also from Oberlin College, mortally wounded at the rifle works. Francis Jackson Marion the son of a very famous abolitionist, Francis Jackson, one-eyed, 21 years old. He escaped. It's interesting that he, the year before, at the age of 20, had visited Haiti because he so admired the Haitian Revolution and wanted to emulate it. Aaron Stevens, wounded under a flag of truce with Watson Brown, executed 2 weeks after John Brown was executed. Dangerfield Newby, 48 years old, the oldest participant in the raid, was coming to start a war that he hoped would free his wife, who was still enslaved. Dangerfield Newby was a fugitive. His wife, back in Prince William County in Northern Virginia, was tending for their 6 children, knew he was coming to try to save her, and had written him a letter. This letter was in his pocket when he was killed. He was the first person killed in the raid. It said, "Oh, Dangerfield, come this fall without fail, money or no money. I want to see you so much. That is my one bright hope, the only hope I have before me." Newby was shot early in the raid, his throat slit, his ears cut off as souvenirs, and a pack of hogs set upon the body. His wife, after it was found that he was coming to free her, was sold to the New Orleans slave market. Charles Kidd, from Maine, a fine singer and a teller of stories, he escaped. Stuart Taylor, a comedian and spiritualist who talked to the dead and cracked weird jokes. Brown's daughter Annie called him nearer a crank than any other man I ever met, shot dead in the doorway of the engine house. William Lehman, age 20, the youngest of the raiders. William Lehman panicked, fled the engine house, tried to swim the Potomac, and was shot dead in the water. He had been kicked out of Harvard for stealing, and he was looking for a way to regain a good name and reputation. He wrote to his mother, "Mother, this will bring me a name and fortune." Dauphin Thompson, a neighbor of Brown, in fact a nephew of Brown, at Brown's farmhouse in North Elba, New York, the youngest of 18 kids, bayoneted at the end of the raid, and his brother William Thompson, a man described as good-natured and kind-hearted, who also liked telling funny stories, captured under a flag of truce, taken to a hotel. When the mayor was shot by one of the Coppock brothers, a lynch mob descended upon him. The daughter of the hotel keeper begged them not to kill him in the hotel, so they dragged him out on the Potomac Bridge, shot him in the head, threw him off the bridge, and people were shooting at him even as his body fell from the bridge and into the water, where he too was the subject of target practice for days afterward. Those are the raiders who hardly anyone knows about, but they were the people who rode with Brown and carried out this ill-begotten raid. Now, after Brown was captured, the Secret Six, for their part, scattered. They took off. So here they are, all of these raiders. I don't know, you have to decide what you want to do with these people. Tip your hat to them, respect them for their bravery, but keep them at some arm's length because of their foolishness or their recklessness or their belief that violence would solve problems. But they serve as, I think, people who haunt us once we look into their eyes and see how young they were. They were so young, most of them in their early 20s, full of idealism, full of hatred for an institution that deserved to be hated, but employing a tactic which in the end was not the tactic that ended slavery. Yeah, I know the Civil War resulted in the end of slavery, but as I'll say in a few minutes, the Civil War did not start out as an anti-slavery war at all. So do what you will with these men, but they haunt me. In a way, I want to admire them. In another way, I decidedly do not. The Secret Six scattered. Frederick Douglass went to London. If he had been apprehended, he was sort of the 7th member of the Secret Six. If Douglass had been apprehended, I have no doubt that Virginia would have brought him back and hanged him. They might have hanged some of the others. There was a Senate investigation headed by James Mason of Virginia, senator from Virginia, and the Mason investigation named the Secret Six, said that they should be arrested and taken back to Virginia for trial. The only person who stayed in the country of the Secret Six was that Unitarian minister, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Theodore Parker might have, but he'd already gone to Europe for his health. Higginson wrote to Frank Sanborn when Sanborn fled the country Sanborn, is there no honor among Confederates? Higginson stayed in Boston and dared people to come and arrest him. Nobody ever did. He said he'd shoot them until his bullets ran out if they tried to arrest him. Nobody ever tried. Brown himself went on trial in Charlestown, Virginia, a few miles from Harper's Ferry. 3-day trial, inevitably resulting in his conviction for treason against Virginia, for inciting slave rebellion, and for murder. He was hanged on December 2nd, 1859, writing a note saying, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." The Southern reaction to Brown's execution was predictable, I suppose. Edmund Ruffin, a Virginia agricultural reformer who'd been advocating secession for many years, Edmund Ruffin toured the South with long pikes. This is part of a long pole to which a very long kind of super bayonet had been attached. Brown had hundreds of these made and was storing them in a building in Maryland, which was uncovered by investigators. Ruffin got hold of one of these, and he toured the South, speaking to audiences about how there was no danger, there was no safety remaining in the Union, but with people like Brown afoot, with abolitionists, he said, now supporting slave rebellion. They're not pacifists anymore. They want to kill us. They want to kill your babies. And he would, at the end of his talk, allow members of the audience to come up and touch the pikes and hold the pikes and look at the blade that would be thrust into the bodies of their husbands, their wives, their children. An ad in the Lynchburg Virginian the following March of 1860, "Abolitionists killed in Lynchburg." Well, not really, but it's certainly attention-getting. And it says the way to kill the northern fanatics is to buy your buggies and wagons at Bailey's on Main Street, Lynchburg, and not send your money north to enrich and enable the abolitionists to make sharps, rifles, and spears to aid our Negroes to kill us with. Now that's tongue-in-cheek, but then again not. It's humorous, but it's deadly serious. This is war. There's not literal war yet, but these people mean to kill us. Don't give them your money. That's how pervasive the thinking about Harper's Ferry and its implications was. Now, of course, slave resistance was not new. Every Virginian knew about Nat Turner in 1831, who in Southampton County in southeast Virginia had led a small uprising that had killed about 60 white people. This woodcut was done immediately after Nat Turner's uprising was put down by the militia. 60 people, the majority of whom were women and children, were killed by Nat Turner's men, including about a dozen children killed at a schoolhouse. This was terror, and it was explicitly terror. Toussaint Louverture's rebellion in Haiti, which had happened in the 1790s and early 19th century, killed thousands of white women and children in Haiti, deliberately, to spread terror and tell the French, you can no longer safely hold us in bondage. You must leave. Terror did the trick in Haiti. Well, maybe it could do the trick for somebody in the United States, too. That is not necessarily what Nat Turner was up to. He seems to have been religiously inspired and acting independently, but Brown knew all about Haiti. And Haiti returned the favor. Brown told his jailer he wanted another Haitian revolution in North America. And Haiti's part, well, they lowered the flags to half-staff for a month after Brown was executed. And they renamed a major boulevard. It's still there in Port-au-Prince, John Brown Boulevard. But I want to end by speculating, is it really clear that we should side with peaceful abolitionists who, after the raid, glorified John Brown for his bravery and his trying, at least, to end slavery? Abolitionists like Wendell Phillips, who said John Brown is like the Lord High Admiral of the Almighty, and Virginia is like a pirate ship, and John Brown is sailing the seas, the Lord High Admiral of the Almighty, seeking to sink the pirate ships of the slave South. Wendell Phillips had spent a lifetime as a pacifist abolitionist, but his response to Brown was typical of these frustrated abolitionists for whom peaceful means had not worked. And if it's going to take violence, many of them were starting to flirt with violence, at least to justify it if somebody else did. Is it really clear, though, that we should celebrate a terrorist whose goal is to start a war, even if the terrorist's goal is right? Consider this: how can we be sure that that war will really be for the same goal as the terrorist goals were? Wars have lives of their own. Goals spin out of sight sometimes and are replaced by new, lesser goals. Yes, the Civil War did evolve in such a way that it ended up ending slavery, but it didn't start out that way. It started out as a war simply to save the Union. And if the North had won in the first year and a half, there would have been no Emancipation Proclamation. It would simply have ended with the Union, with slavery being restored. Consider this too: how can we be sure who will win that war? It's folly to think the Confederacy had no chance to win the Civil War. It had quite a bit of a chance to win. When you let loose the dogs of war, you don't know who's going to win or what's going to win. And consider, how can we be sure that the evil created by a war, the further consecration of violence, the suffering it causes, the hatred it deepens, the new problems it creates, because they always create new problems, that will not exceed the good that it does. And remember, the Civil War ended slavery, but it also set the stage for redoubled entrenchment of white supremacy, which had become a primary reason for slavery in the first place. Wars are irrational. They can't be controlled. By definition, they are evil. It's easy to see why so many anti-slavery people idolized Brown after his death and do so today. The frustration, the feeling of inadequacy because they hadn't been willing to do what Brown did, to finally try to bring an end to the atrocity. But we who live 160 years later and have supposedly some perspective might ask, had Brown done not only what those abolitionists couldn't do and didn't do, had he had done what they never should have done, what he never should have done? Consider that the abolitionist movement, despite its people's frustrations, had already done good, important, noble work, vital work. It had held up the ideal without compromise and had shown America its own undeniable hypocrisy, its own cruelty hiding behind all the chest-thumping, cloying, liberty-drenched patriotic rhetoric. That's what radicals do. They hold up the ideal, and God help us whenever we lack such people. And radicals do something else. They pressure mainstream politics. They create an atmosphere which can grow a bigger movement grounded in the same general belief, in this case the evil of slavery, but one willing to compromise, to take half a loaf now so the whole loaf might come the next day or the day after. And in Brown's time, that moderate position was called the Republican Party. Abolitionists could take some credit for Republicans, for they gave Republicans cover. Abolitionist radicalism gave political legitimacy to Republican moderation. And what was that Republican Party moderation? Well, Republicans believed that you should bottle up slavery in the South. They believed the Constitution didn't permit the federal government to abolish slavery in the southern states, but it did permit it to be banned from the territories, it to be banned forever from expanding anywhere. They would strangle slavery, bottle it up and strangle it slowly to where it eventually would become non-viable as an economic institution. And they would capture the White House, which they did in 1860, and with it, the responsibility of appointing judges. And so the pro-slavery, slave-owning judges who in the Dred Scott decision in 1857 had said that black people, slave or free, could not be citizens of the United States, and had said that slavery cannot be banned by Congress from any territory ever. Those justices could die and resign and be replaced by foursquare anti-slavery justices who would wipe out white supremacy and the protection slavery had from the statute books, and even from the Constitution, if possible. In other words, the Republicans and Lincoln wanted a moral cordon against slavery, causing its gradual strangulation without war. And slave owners understood that that was a serious threat. That's why they seceded when Lincoln was elected. They wouldn't accept that election. What did Republicans say of John Brown? The 1860 platform declared him, quote, justly hanged. And Lincoln said, we cannot object to his hanging, even though he agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. That can never excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. Lincoln never praised Brown, for he never praised violence. And Lincoln always argued that while violence was sometimes necessary in self-defense, especially in defense literally of keeping the nation together, as a means to achieve a goal, violence and terror as a legitimate and acceptable tool in the toolkit of moral people, no matter how righteous their cause, would only serve to sanctify violence and terror and legitimize terror in the hands of the evil and the unrighteous. This is from yesterday's New York Times. Another person, a white guy, who wanted to start a race war by terror. Even at his moment of greatest victory in 1865, after some 750,000 deaths in the American Civil War, but on the eve of triumph, Lincoln was in no mood to gloat. Rather than triumphalism in his second inaugural address a month before his own murder, Lincoln, rather than declare, we have won, mission accomplished, we're great, Lincoln gave the American people, mostly the northern people, a lesson in morality and self-knowledge and self-reflection. He said, the Almighty has his own purposes. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as it was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. What Lincoln said essentially in the second inaugural was, let's work against injustice as much as we can within the law. Let's accept violence and self-defense when someone else initiates violence to destroy our nation. But let's never be so righteous as to think our hands are absolutely clean and that other person's are irredeemably dirty. With humility, let's try to leave the ultimate moral judgments to God. And now, in giving us this terrible civil war over an institution that both North and South was responsible for, God is laying a damning judgment on all of us. And that, after all, is God's job. Thank you. And then, having eaten probably unforgivably into her time, I turn things over to my favorite art historian, Kathleen Placidi.
Coming out today, and I have the unenviable task of following John. But I have lots of images that we'll be looking at together, so that will help in the task. And as you probably already knew, and certainly as you've been reminded by John, John Brown is truly a larger-than-life figure, and his exploits and legacy have been the subject of both popular and fine art, some examples of which I'm going to be showing you today. And what I'm going to be concentrating on are images of Brown from the 19th century and then in the 20th century from the 1930s and 40s. Now, the first artistic representations of Brown were contemporary photographs. And the photograph from 1847 is the earliest known image of Brown, and it was taken by a black photographer named Augustus Washington, who had a studio in Hartford, Connecticut. And given Brown's ideas on black equality, it's not surprising probably that for his very first photograph he chose a black artist. And we see Brown 47 years old, looking quite grimly determined in the photograph. He's raising one hand as though taking an oath, and in the other hand he's holding a flag, which is believed to be the banner of an organization he was trying to put together called the Subterranean Passway, which was a militant version of an underground railroad, but it didn't really come to pass. The 1859 photograph of Brown, which John has already shown you, taken in Boston with his new beard, really does give Brown the aura of a biblical prophet. And as John mentioned, the deeply religious Brown really did think of himself in terms of being a fiery, modern-day prophet who would bring the righteous sword of justice down upon the evil slave owners. And in his writings, Brown wrote very prophetically. From Kansas, for example, he wrote home to his wife that he and his men were like Daniel of old, referring to the prophet Daniel of the Old Testament. He once pronounced that there would be no peace in this land until the scourge of slavery had been wiped away. And this 1859 image of Brown, as we'll see, was often used by artists when depicting Brown. Now, Brown's trial and execution were covered by the popular press, both North and South. And I'm going to show you just a few representative examples, all from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And certainly the mid-19th century was the great age of the illustrated newspaper, which were illustrated with woodcut illustrations. You can see this is definitely taken from the photograph of Brown from 1859. Here on the left, you see Brown riding to his execution, and here's Brown. And it is macabre, but he sat on his coffin, riding in the cart. Then you see here Brown going up the scaffold to his death. Because Governor Wise of Virginia was worried about security at the execution, worried that someone would try to spirit Brown away, he had as many troops there as possible. There were about 1,000 troops lining the streets and guarding the execution site, and among them were a group of cadets from the Virginia Military Institute and several faculty members, one of whom was Major Thomas Jackson, who would be better known then as Stonewall once the Civil War started. And in a letter he wrote that night, the night of the execution, to his wife, he described Brown as behaving with unflinching firmness on the scaffold, and that he attended his own execution with apparent cheerfulness. He also described what Brown was wearing: a black frock coat, vest, white shirt with no tie, because of course the noose would be his tie. He also said Brown was wearing white socks and red carpet slippers. Now, very quickly, popular song and poetry were written about the martyred Brown. This poem, Brown of Osawatomie, by John Greenleaf Whittier, was published in the New York Independent barely 3 weeks after Brown's death. And I'm showing you just the first 3 stanzas here. And this poem was inspired by Brown reaching out on his way down the jailhouse steps to kiss a young enslaved baby, the child of a slave mother. And this incident had been reported in the New York Herald Tribune's account of Brown's execution. Except the incident never happened. The New York Herald Tribune made it up. But it was a good story, and as we'll see, it inspired quite a lot of artwork, not only this poem by Whittier, but poems, other poems, and also paintings. But the problem with centering one's portrayal of Brown on this fictional act of blessing the enslaved child is that it downplays Brown as a violent revolutionary and instead stresses his nobler aspects, his devotion to the righteous cause of abolition, and then his martyrdom to the cause. And the first artwork to be based on the kiss and inspired by Whittier's poem was a painting by an American artist named Louis Ransom. Now, this painting is lost today, and we know it from this print, this 1863 Currier and Ives print. And in it you see Brown, clearly based on the 1859 photograph, who is looking down at this very Madonna and childlike enslaved mother and her child. This painting was quite popular. It was exhibited by P.T. Barnum in his museum in New York in the year 1863, though he then had to take it off exhibit during the riots that broke out that year because of the draft for the war. And we know that the Currier and Ives print sold very well. For example, a lot of newly emancipated black families in 1863 bought copies of the print. In turn, Whittier's poem inspired this painting by Thomas Satterwhite Noble, an interesting man, a Kentuckian who was from a slave-owning family, and most of his artworks do deal with the topic of slavery in some way. Now here we again see Brown, based on that 1859 photograph, and in this picture, in this picture he's actually reaching down to give a benign sort of blessing with his hand to the head of the child. The next work to be inspired by Whittier's poem and the apocryphal story of kissing the slave child is this work by Irish-American artist Thomas Hovenden. Except in this work, Brown actually does kiss the child, and the mother is raising the child up to Brown. And unlike the earlier two paintings by Ransom and Noble, in this work, Brown looks somewhat less patriarchal and less fearsome. Now what's interesting is that even though Hovenden based this painting on this fictional episode of the kiss, he otherwise carried out very careful research for it. He went to Charlestown, where Brown was tried and executed. He did sketches there. He interviewed residents, including Brown's jailer. And he also very carefully depicted Brown's clothing. And you can see that he's wearing the carpet slippers and wide socks that Stonewall Jackson had described. Hovenden also created an etching based on his painting, and every copy of the etching in the original run was sold with a copy of Whittier's poem. Now, in the last years of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, visual interest in Brown seemed to wane. But in the 1930s and 40s, there was quite a resurgence of interest in depictions of Brown. Now, this bronze sculpture is by Joseph Pollia, a sculptor based in Boston who is best known for doing memorial sculptures. It's at the John Brown farm site, historic park in Lake Placid, New York. That's where North Elba, Brown's farm, was. Brown is also buried there, but this statue is not a grave marker, it's just there to commemorate Brown. And ironically, the artist Pollia's best-known sculpture is this work, this equestrian monument of Stonewall Jackson, which is at the Manassas National Battlefield Park. But the sculpture of Brown at the homestead was commissioned by the John Brown Memorial Association, which was a group founded in 1922 by leading members of the NAACP. And every year on Brown's birthday, May 9th, they would go to the homestead to lay a wreath upon his grave. And at the sculpture's unveiling on Brown's birthday in 1935, his 135th birthday, over 1,500 people attended the unveiling, which certainly shows that Brown was still a very vivid figure to people in the 20th century. The renewed interest among American artists in Brown in the 30s and 40s is really part of a larger interest at the time in portraying scenes of American history. The interest in Brown may also have been stimulated by a growing interest in left-wing causes, such as civil rights, and by the fight against fascism abroad, first in Spain and then throughout Europe, in which violence seemed justified, armed resistance seemed justified. And during this period, the human figure was a primary vehicle for many American artists who sought to create artworks that they thought would be accessible and understandable to a mass audience. Many artists at this time were supported through Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, specifically the federal arts project within the WPA. And also, many at the time were inspired to create history paintings because they admired the work of the Mexican muralists like Diego Rivera, whose History of Mexico you see here, and his compatriot Jose Clemente Orozco. Now, one of the leading images of Brown created in the 1930s is this mural by John Stuart Curry, which is in the Kansas State House. Curry was born and raised in Kansas and became one of the leading so-called regionalist painters who specialized in subject matter of the Midwest. He was commissioned to do murals for the State House and decided that their theme should contrast the tragedy of Kansas's past with its current tranquility. And so the centerpiece of what he called the tragic prelude is Brown. So we see him as a wild-eyed prophet, rifle in one hand, Bible in the other, and the depiction is based on the 1859 photograph of Brown, also on Michelangelo's Moses. We see that Brown looms large, literally. He towers over the other figures, both living and dead, who represent pro- and anti-slavery forces. And behind him is the succeeding turmoil in Kansas, the Civil War. So we see Union forces on one side, Confederate on the other. Behind them, uncontrollable nature as prairie fires blaze and a tornado blows. So Curry does not openly depict Brown committing an act of violence here, but it certainly shows him at the center of a violent maelstrom, which his own actions helped to trigger. And many Kansans did not like this mural, by the way. They thought it overemphasized the state's bloody past. Even so, this painting has become one of the most famous images of John Brown, and it's very widely reproduced. Now, the next American artist to take on Brown in a meaningful way was Jacob Lawrence, who created a 22-painting series, The Life of John Brown, in 1941, and also at the same time created an independent standalone work, John Brown's Arsenal, which is in the collection of the Maier Museum. Most of Jacob Lawrence's paintings were done in series, historical series that depicted famous Black people or the cultural experiences of Black Americans, and in which the captions were written by Lawrence, and they are an integral part of the total artwork. So Lawrence is arguably a history painter. He's a storyteller and a visual medium, and a number of scholars have compared him to the tradition of the West African griot, who tells tales from the past that have meaning for the present and the future. Now, Lawrence was one of the first Black artists to receive major recognition during his career. He was born in Atlantic City in 1917. After his parents separated, his father Jacob worked for the railroads. His mother Rosalie was a domestic. His mother and the children relocated to Harlem. They came there in 1930 when Lawrence was 13 years old. And Harlem was really the perfect place for a budding young African-American artist to be, because it was at the heart of a flowering of African-American culture known as the Harlem Renaissance. Now, also called the New Negro Movement, from Alain Locke's influential 1925 book, The New Negro. Many of the movement's leading artists were centered in Harlem, though there were important contributions made to the movement by people across the country. For example, right here in Lynchburg, the poet Ann Spencer was a leading poet of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, in his book, The New Negro, Locke urged Black artists to create powerful and positive images of Blacks for Blacks. He also urged Black artists to look at African art, be inspired by it, and take it back from avant-garde white artists who had appropriated ideas from Black art, such as Picasso. Now, while Lawrence was too young to fully participate in the Harlem Renaissance, he was nurtured by its atmosphere, and many of its leading figures, including Locke, became his mentors. and Lawrence always credited his teachers, mentors, church leaders, and elders in Harlem with encouraging him to explore themes of Black history in his art. He said the stories they told about heroic Black men and women inspired him. Now, his first historical series, The Life of Toussaint Louverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution, was done in 1938. Now, when Lawrence started researching Toussaint, he decided there was just too much about the man and the Haitian Revolution to portray in one image. So he decided that he would do a series of paintings about Toussaint, and he ended up doing a 41 painting series, which was incredibly ambitious for such a young artist because this was really his first major work. And the work also shows that from the very beginning of his career, Lawrence wanted to convey the sweep of Black history and the struggle of Black people to obtain freedom and equality. The series also shows that Lawrence was not afraid to shy away from depicting acts of violence. Number 10, for example, shows a slave owner brutally flogging an enslaved worker. Number 17, this is one of the great images in the series, shows Toussaint leading men on horseback into battle. Here, number 19 portrays the murderous retaliation carried out by Blacks against their former oppressors. And you can see that Lawrence's style here is abstracted, simplified, bold, very modern. He uses bright colors and a flat, unmodeled style that is inspired in part on synthetic cubism. He followed this series on Toussaint Louverture with a 32 painting series on Frederick Douglass in 1939 and a 31 painting series on the life of Harriet Tubman in 1940. And each series stresses the importance of active resistance to oppression. Both Douglass and Tubman had liberated themselves, escaping from slavery into freedom, and then both furthered the cause of Black liberty, Douglass through his writing and his powerful oratory, Tubman through her very brave and heroic return journeys to the South to conduct escaping people to freedom in the North. The Tubman series and the Douglass series also show that Lawrence was already thinking about John Brown. There are 2 paintings in the Douglass series that show Brown and 1 painting in the Tubman series. And Brown was friends with Tubman and Douglass, and as John said, he met with Douglass and talked with him very seriously about his planned raid on Harper's Ferry. Lawrence's most renowned work is the Migration series, a 60-panel series inspired by the Great Migration, the exodus of over 1 million Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North that took place from around 1916 until sometime after World War II. Lawrence knew many people who were part of the migration. His own parents had come from the South to the North, and so this work had a lot of personal meaning for him. And throughout this series, Lawrence does not individualize the figures, but this gives them a universality, which emphasizes that the migration experience was shared by many Black Americans. And the first panel shown here, and the last panel, number 60, along with other panels along the way that punctuate the series, show Southern Blacks in the act of traveling north in search of economic, social, and educational opportunity. By this, Lawrence makes it clear that the Great Migration was a movement of agency, and this voluntary migration was the exact opposite of the horrific Middle Passage, the involuntary, forced migration that brought captured Africans across the Atlantic to North America as slaves. And then I show you next to the final image in the Great Migration series, the famous 18th century image of the slave ship, showing how really horrifically human beings were packed into the holds of these ships. Lawrence also makes it clear in the Migration series that the people carrying out the act of migrating were carrying out an act of resistance. It was economic resistance and it was social resistance. People were deliberately removing themselves from an unfair labor market and leaving behind intolerable, oppressive, even deathly conditions in the South. And as well as portraying the benefits of locating to the North, such as better jobs, housing, and the ability to vote, Lawrence also shows that even in the North, Black Americans still faced threats of violence, such as race riots and firebombings, which you see in image 51, as well as subtler forms of discrimination, as in image 49. So we see again that Lawrence is not afraid to depict scenes of violence in his art, though in the case of the Migration series, the violence is all perpetrated by whites against blacks. So we come to Lawrence's 22 painting series on John Brown. It's unique in his oeuvre in that it centers on the actions of a white man. It's also unique for its close integration of religious faith with violence. Brown painted the series in the last months of 1941. He and his wife, fellow artist Gwendolyn Knight, were in New Orleans, and Lawrence was supported by a Rosenwald Fellowship. The 22 paintings in the series tell an encapsulated history of Brown's career. They're linked by their style, which is abstracted, simplified by hard-edge forms. They're linked by a limited color palette, predominantly yellows, browns, white, black, deep blue, with, as we'll see, effective touches of red, and linked by recurrent motifs: crosses, nails, swords, pikes, rifles, and gun belts with cartridges. 9 of the 22 images have a connection to violence by depicting training for conflict, or stockpiles of weapons, or travel on the way to conflict, fighting itself, or the aftermath of violence. 7 of the 22 images have a connection to faith by depicting Christ or other religious figures, or Brown praying, or showing crosses. Now, Lawrence introduces the series in this first image with an image of faith. We see Christ on the cross. But the image deliberately conflates Jesus with John Brown, the martyr. Notice that the figure's face is hidden by his hair, as are some of the images of Brown in later paintings in this series. The text introduces Brown, his belief and his cause, but makes no mention of Jesus Christ. And you'll also notice that below the cross, red blood seeps into the earth. So Lawrence is signaling that the overthrow of slavery will be violent. Notice, too, the very large nails in the crucified figure, and we will see similar nails in this, the second image. So you see the nails holding rifles to the wall, next to them hang swords. Around the table, we see Brown and members of his family with their heads bowed in prayer with a Bible on the table. So this image of faith foreshadows the violence to come with those rifles and the swords, and shows how faith and violent action were connected in Brown's mind. And it also, I think, echoes Jesus' remarks in the New Testament book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 34. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, images 3 and 4 deal with Brown's failing business ventures. And number 4 shows Brown at prayer. Notice the large cross on the wall and a painting of sheep, alluding to Christ as the Good Shepherd hanging on the wall. Images 5, 6, 7, and 8 show Brown beginning to formulate his plans to resist slavery by force of arms. And each of the 4 paintings contains an area of red. So by this means, Lawrence is foreshadowing the bloodshed to come. And image number 6 introduces a motif which will appear very prominently in many of the paintings and also appears very prominently in the Maier's painting, that of a gun belt with cartridges. Paintings 9 through 12 portray Brown's violent actions in Kansas, where Brown and his band battled pro-slavery forces. So in number 9, probably alluding to the burning of Lawrence canvas, you see that the homestead has been burned. You can see someone has been hung, lynched from this tree, and you can also see that the ground is red, the idea that this is literally bloody Kansas. Number 10 has a text in which Lawrence uses the word murder. These pro-slavery were murdered by those anti-slavery. But in spite of him using the word murder, I would argue that Lawrence does not seem to be condemning this violence. For example, the sword plunged into the body of this dead pro-slavery man looks like a cross. Notice the snake slithering across another body, the snake often a symbol of evil to show us that slavery is evil, and then so are people who support the cause of slavery. Images 11 and 12 show very prominently again that motif of the gun belt cartridge, and interestingly in image 12 you can't really tell which fighter is on which side of the conflict. Image 13, a very boldly geometric composition and one of the most striking of the 22 paintings, shows Brown in the middle of a room with symbols of violence on one side and faith on the other, studying a blood-red map while he thinks about where he's going to strike against slavery. Notice, again, nails hanging, a rifle and gun belt cartridges on the wall. Here, the cross very prominently hanging, brilliantly illuminated by this triangle of light from a lantern, a Bible on the chair beside him. Images 14 through 18 show the lead up to the raid on Harper's Ferry. Now in number 14, Brown appears as a humble supplicant, literally begging for funds, and he's flanked by images of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, and on the other side, the crucified Christ. And note the similarities between the depiction of Brown's head, his facial features, his facial hair, and those of Christ. So once again, in his imagery, Lawrence is deliberately conflating the martyr to come, Brown, and the martyred Jesus Christ. Here, more images of Brown's planning for Harper's Ferry. And then here, number 18, depicting the stockpile of weapons being ready for the Harper's Ferry raid. And this is the image in the series that is most similar to the Maier's painting, which we'll get to in a moment. Number 19 shows the party traveling to Harper's Ferry to carry out the raid. Again, one of the most striking images in the series, with Brown and his men represented abstractly by the pikes that they're carrying. We see them over the edge of the rolling hills. Again, the land colored red with blood, a foretelling of the disaster at Harper's Ferry. Here, Lawrence shows the actual fighting itself. Brown is the figure here on the extreme left. Notice the sword, and Brown did have a sword at Harper's Ferry, but here the sword looks very much like a cross, and I think this makes Brown look like a knight crusader. So we can think of Brown and his raiders as holy crusaders in the cause of anti-slavery. We see again very prominently the motif of the gun belt cartridges. Again, they're always shown very, very abstractly. Number 21 shows Brown after his capture, probably in jail, either awaiting his trial or awaiting execution. And here we see Brown at prayer, a blood-red cross in his hands, really foretelling his martyr's fate, with red the color of martyrs. And you can't help but wonder, is Brown praying for forgiveness? Is he praying for God to smite the slaveholders? Is he praying for freedom for enslaved people? Maybe all of the above. Notice his face is completely obscured by his hair falling down over it, just as the crucified figure in the first image in the series had an obscured face. So again, we see the deliberate conflation of Brown the martyr with Jesus Christ. And then the final, very striking image of Brown He's been hanged, so his martyrdom is complete. And presumably, his path is heavenward because we see behind him a serene blue sky and clouds. Now, Maier's painting, John Brown's Arsenal, is clearly related to number 18 in the series of the Arsenal. So both depict the stockpile of weapons in preparation for the raid, with an emphasis on rifles and cartridge belts. Now, a number of scholars thought that the painting that ended up in the Maier may have been a rejected study for what became the final work. But former Randolph-Macon Women's College art history professor Laura Katzman had the great privilege of interviewing Mr. Lawrence in Seattle in June of 1998. And he told her that the painting, the Maier's painting, is an example of the kind of finished paintings he would create while working on a series. He told her that they're integral to his thinking process, but they don't necessarily end up in the final series. So we can think of this painting then as an independent, standalone, though closely related work. Now the color palettes of the two works are quite different because in the Maier's painting, oranges, reds, and blacks predominate, and there isn't any blue in the painting at all. In Arsenal, you see that rifles are stacked together, forming a kind of teepee shape. Here are gun belt cartridges hanging on the wall and also on the floor below the rifles. Another major difference between the Maier's painting and the painting in the series is that in the Maier's painting, the rifles are topped with what seem to be serrated-edged bayonets, which make them look somewhat like a cross between a rifle and a pike, although the pikes that Brown did have prepared for the raid, he intended to hand them out as weapons to the slaves who he imagined would come to Harper's Ferry and join the rebellion. So you can see that the blades really don't look anything like the actual pike blades. But as I mentioned, the design of the gun belt cartridges, which feature so prominently in this work and in many of the paintings in the Life of John Brown series, are highly abstracted. And they're very geometric, they're yellow, they have that horizontality. And they remind me of the horizontal reinforcements in Zulu shields. Now, I don't know if Lawrence was familiar with Zulu shields, but he did see collections of African art and artifacts in Harlem, and he was introduced to Pan-African history by his mentors and teachers in Harlem. And Zulu warriors were renowned for their fierce courage in battle. So if Lawrence did think about Zulu shields in creating the abstracted gun belt cartridges, it might have been a way to salute the valor of Brown and his fellow raiders for putting their lives on the line in an attempt to overthrow slavery. Now, another difference between this painting and the others is that since it's not part of the series, it does not have an accompanying narrative text. It just has its title, John Brown's Arsenal, which of course makes one think of the whole point of the raid in part being to capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. But I also wonder if Lawrence was thinking of President Franklin Roosevelt's December 1940 speech, just a year before the United States entered World War II, about the arsenal of democracy, in which he announced that America would help arm and send military aid to other countries around the world who were fighting the Axis powers. And then in Brown's case, the arsenal would be used to try to defeat another horrific power, the slave power. Yet Lawrence wasn't the only African-American artist in the 1940s to create images of Brown. Two other artists did, and these were Horace Pippin and William H. Johnson. Now, Pippin created a three-painting series on Brown in 1942. Pippin was a self-taught artist who originally took up painting to strengthen his right arm, which had been wounded during his combat service in World War I when he was a member of the famous Harlem Hellfighters Regiment who fought with French troops on the Western Front. And Pippin's work often depicted themes of African American history or life, and while in this 3-painting series, he doesn't openly portray Brown's violent acts. He does underscore in John Brown reading the Bible that Brown's actions were rooted in his deep religious faith. And then in the trial of John Brown, and in the 3rd painting, John Brown going to his hanging, does show us that Brown paid the ultimate price, his life, for his beliefs. So he was a martyr to the cause. And one particularly interesting thing about this 3rd painting is this figure here. She's the only black figure in the painting. And notice that she's turned her back on Brown, or mainly the crowd. She doesn't want to see him pass by on his way to death. And again, here he is sitting on his coffin. Well, according to family lore, Horace Pippin's grandmother was there in the crowd that day and saw Brown being taken to his execution. So, presumably, that is who Pippin is depicting here, his grandmother, and so that gave him a very personal connection to John Brown. And then here is William H. Johnson's painting of Brown, John Brown Legend, done around 1945. This was part of a series that Johnson did called Fighters for Freedom, which also had an image of Abraham Lincoln, of George Washington, and of Booker T. Washington. And the centerpiece of the painting is that fictional but compelling story of Brown reaching down to kiss a slave child on his way to the gallows. But Johnson packed a lot about Brown into this one image, and many of the images in his painting are based on contemporary photographs. So here in the upper left are the Secret Six. Here's Brown himself, hanged. You can see constellations in the sky, in this case forming the sign of the cross. This is Harper's Ferry. So again, here's the Potomac. Here's the Shenandoah. This is Brown himself, and this is based on that 1846 painting from Kansas. These are 4 of the raiders. This is Stevens, for example. This is his son Watson. This is Caggie. On this side, this is Brown's father, Owen Brown, who was a renowned abolitionist in his own right. These are scenes from Charlestown, where Brown was tried and convicted. This is the courthouse. The one mystery to me were these 4 men. And John and I puzzled about this, and then I decided that they're probably the 4 sons who outlived John Brown, shown in old age. Notice too, there's a hand here holding a rifle. So the image doesn't directly show Brown engaged in an act of violence, but it does show images relating to the raid on Harper's Ferry and its aftermath. So in conclusion, as we've seen, images depicting Brown tended to shy away from portraying him actually engaged in murder and mayhem by casting him in a more noble light. They passed over the bloody revolutionary to emphasize the martyr to the cause of abolition. Only Jacob Lawrence fully grappled with the paradoxical aspects of John Brown, of the man of deep religious conviction who knew that slavery was an abomination, and of the man who was willing to carry out abominable acts of violence to end slavery forever. No American artist engaged more deeply, thoroughly, and thoughtfully with Brown and his violent legacy than did Jacob Lawrence. So we are indeed fortunate that his painting, John Brown's Arsenal, resides today in the collection of the Maier Museum of Art. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Don. And it seems to me that as a study of history, graduate of history, the history tells me a slightly different story. First of all, thank you for presenting the new information that you presented today. But you you purported that the Civil War was not over the institution of slavery, and my understanding, the readings that I have done, is that one of the major things that the South seceded because of was because they were opposed to states' rights, and specifically the right not to agree with slavery, the institution of slavery. And in their documentation, their declaration of this immediate need to secede from the Union, they state very clearly that their identity, they were very firmly identified with the institution of slavery, but there were a lot of elements happening at the same time. You had the Industrial Revolution, which brings about a decreased need for an agrarian way of life, but it was over slavery. It was absolutely over slavery because the free labor is what provided the economic commerce for the success of the South. And so there was a growing hostility between non-slave holding northern states and the southern states that wanted to continue the way of living, but they were just not moving they were not evolving and moving forward with the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you. And we don't disagree. I want to make this clear. Slavery caused the Civil War. The southern states, first 7 of them, then later 4 more, left the Union because Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, and Abraham Lincoln was pledged to halt the expansion of slavery. He was not pledged to end slavery, but to halt the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. He wanted to strangle slavery slowly because he felt that was the only legal and constitutional power that the federal government had. But that was enough to make the slave owners who ran the southern states feel that they had to leave. Strangling slavery and shooting in the head were the same thing in their minds. They wanted to leave their human property to their children and grandchildren. They wanted slavery perpetuated. So in that sense, slavery caused the Civil War. But Abraham Lincoln, when he called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, made it very clear that this was not a war to end slavery, to abolish slavery. It was a war to restore the Union. And as late as the summer of 1862, in a letter to Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, that was published and reprinted in many newspapers all over the country, he said, if it requires me to free 1 slave to save the Union, I'll do that. If it requires me to free all the slaves to save the Union, I'll do that. If I'm required to free no slaves to save the Union, I'll do that. That his objective was to save the Union. And in fact, the Congress, in the summer of 1861, right after the Battle of Bull Run, passed a resolution, a Johnson-Crittenden resolution, specifically saying that this war is not an abolition war. It's a war only to save the Union. And had the Union, the United States, won the war more quickly, had it won the war as late as the summer of '62, a year and a half into the war, the Union would have been restored with slavery still in the South. It only evolved into a war to abolish slavery when it became clear to the president and to his cabinet and to the Republican majority in Congress that the only way to defeat the Confederacy, which was doing a whole lot better in the war than some hoped it would, the only way to beat the Confederacy was to strike at the heart of its labor system and to pronounce the slaves in the Confederate States free, forever free, in the hope that that would encourage them to stop working, go to Union lines, fight in the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation also proclaimed that blacks would be admitted to the Union Army for the first time. So it became an abolitionist war as a war measure. And Lincoln only did that because he felt that's the way to win the war, and I, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, am given the power to do this by the Constitution, because as Commander-in-Chief, I have the constitutional power to do what is necessary to have my armed forces beat the enemy.
Would you agree that it was inextricably intertwined?
Oh, well, sure. So slavery was the cause of the Civil War, but it's important, I think, especially for people who believe that the Civil War was good guys against bad guys, to know that racism was a national phenomenon, that the northern population was not united in feeling that we must do away with slavery. The majority of soldiers, Gary Gallagher at UVA has just written a book about this a couple of years ago called The Union War. As far as we can tell, the great majority of Union soldiers who rushed to enlist did so because they were angry that their country was being broken up, not because they wanted personally to see slavery ended. That's the reality. The fact is, though, that when black soldiers were recruited, Frederick Douglass recruited thousands of them himself, threw himself into that task after the beginning of 1863, in the middle of the war. Northern public opinion, white public opinion shifted. And you can see it in pictures, in engravings of black people that were published in Frank Leslie's and Harper's Weekly. It went from pictures of black people with all the stereotypes of black people eating chicken legs and watermelon and in the cotton field and exaggerated features. And now the pictures were of handsome black men with their heads held high in uniform, fighting for their freedom, and dignified, beautiful black women sewing flags and supporting them. The war turned into an abolition war, but it didn't start as one. So if John Brown had been successful in starting a war because of his terrorism, which he wasn't, the South didn't secede because of John Brown, it seceded because of Lincoln's election. If he had succeeded, there was no guarantee that a war that he started would end slavery. The only guarantee was that it would kill a lot of people. That was my point. Is that a little clearer now? So the war was caused by slavery, but it wasn't anti-slavery people versus pro-slavery people. It was more complicated than that. And you know, that's why I think a lot of neo-Confederate people find it so annoying that as they would put it, the Yankees are unwilling to admit that they were racist too, and that the Stars and Stripes flew over slavery too.
Yes.
And they're right about that part.
Yes.
You know, they're right about that. There were 4 states that had slavery that never seceded. Lincoln's United States still had Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky as slave states within the Union, and he had to be careful not to move against slavery too fast, lest they join the Confederacy. So it's complicated.
It's
very complicated.
Thank you.
Does anyone have another question?
Do you think that the rise of the John Brown killings had anything to do with the rise of the KKK at that same time?
That's an interesting point. I don't know, but I really think more broadly a lot of it is just that in the 30s and 40s there were many artists who were very interested in doing historic subjects, and I think because there was a growing interest in progressive causes, at least among some in the United States at the time, it did seem like, oh, you know, John Brown fighting against slavery, what a good thing to do. And again, I think that ambivalence of Brown, I think you really do see in those images, because it really is only Lawrence that dwells on the violence of Brown. Because again, if you're showing Brown, you know, reaching out to pick up a child and kiss it, or pat a young black man on the back, that's a definite side of Brown, the side that believed in equality. Brown, who helped settle black families around his own farm in North Elba. For example, the man who was given the honor of unveiling the Pollia statue of Brown at the Brown Homestead in 1935. That was an 87-year-old black American named Lyman Epps, who as a little boy had come to North Elba with his family because he was one of the families that Brown had helped settle there. And he had also been there in 1859 at Brown's burial. So, yeah, you know, I don't know if the KKK might have had something to do with that or not. I would say it's probably more broadly the interest in doing scenes of American history. And you know, a lot of the artists were funded by the government through the Federal Arts Project of the WPA, and they were supposed to be picking topics, you know, suitable for public buildings. So it's this idea of public edification, that you do a scene of American history or a scene of, you know, American social justice or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just a topic I now want to pursue, because I'm interested.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea.
And the rise of it, starting in the 1910s, with all the taking down of statues and everything, rising back, that history is rising to prominence.
I would add that the Klan really, the revived Klan reaches its peak really in the mid-1920s, and by the 30s and 40s, it's receding significantly. So if Lawrence had been doing a series in the 20s, then one might say that it's the Klan, but I think it's more broadly that there's pervasive, deep-seated racism in America that is at its ugliest in the South.
Well,
And that's what's causing
the migration is driven. The 20s migration
The
is
migration.
definitely driven, and which his family was part of it. So much of the communities. I mean, I love the painting that had Chicago, St. Louis.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Because those were, and you know what happened with the South Side of Chicago. I'm not as familiar with St. Louis, but
The migration's underway before the Klan makes its comeback. And in fact, it's World War I, and the opportunities, the economic opportunities in the factories of northern cities that really is the initial catalyst for the migration. In other words, this too is complicated. In fact, let that be our answer to every single question. You know the answer is already.
I have a question for our historian about John Brown's, the image that was in Frank Leslie's.
Oh, yes.
Illustrated images, him going to the gallows, did not have the big white beard,
No,
But-
Brown
but
actually,
the other images did, so I was just
Yeah.
wondering about that.
Brown actually cut his beard pretty short just before the Harper's Ferry raid, and I don't know how much of that was just military practicality, you know, maybe having a beard going down to your chest is not the best thing to have. Because some remarked on that in terms of descriptions of Brown at the time. There are descriptions of him having a much more closely cropped beard. But I think the image of him with that long patriarchal beard is just so striking that I think that's why you see it in so many of the artistic depictions.
Any other? Oh, this will be the last one.
I was just curious, did you think that Lawrence deliberately painted the rifles in the John Brown's arsenal painting in that manner, as the same manner as the Confederates stacked their arms after the surrender in Appomattox?
Oh, I don't know. That's an interesting point. It makes a nice design, you know, the way he has the rifles stacked in that almost teepee-like shape. That's interesting. I don't know if he thought of that at all.
Rifles were stacked that way.
Yeah, that's a pretty common way to stack